Okay, hey folks. So this week we're going to focus on the empire. We're going to take a look at Caesar and Augustus and tons of other really crazy emperors. But before doing that, we need to talk about the fall of the Roman Republic. So the question we're going to look at is, did Rome have strong foundations that would give rise to a great empire to come? The Roman Republic, as we talked about last week, lasts for 500 years. It is very successful. It manages to really expand its boundaries without, the rule of one king. So the fact that it falls sometimes, can be questionable. Why does this great republic that lasts seemingly so well and so successfully for 500 years then fall into an empire under the rule of one man once again? So we're going to take a look at that today before we start looking at the actual emperors themselves. So some of the key things that you were supposed to have looked at last week when you looked at the Roman Republic, we're just going to do a really quick kind of recap of some of those things so that we have an understanding of the system that we're looking at today before it falls. One of the key things was patricians and plebeians. These are essentially wealthy people versus common people. So with the patricians, you're looking at all of these things listed here in the T-chart. It is the smaller portion of the population, as typically is in civilizations. And the plebeians, those commoners, the kind of peasants, craftspeople, those are the majority of the population. So those two differences are key for both the Roman Republic as well as the Roman Empire. So those terms are definitely terms to remember, patrician and plebeian. In terms of what was going on within the Republic, they actually do, and hopefully when you were putting together your Roman Republic chart, you managed to notice that actually most of the roles combine both patrician and plebeian people within them, men, of course, within them. So it is not a system that is, always under the control of the wealthy. So it's important to note that, because that balance, that difference is really important. Obviously in the beginning it was a little bit more heavily weighted towards the patricians. The plebeians have to kind of fight to get their voices heard in the Republic, but eventually they are. This little ladder here shows you some of the key roles that you should have looked at. There were a bunch of different committees that you should have looked at, various assemblies and whatnot of different numbers. Also, the numbers of how many people are within each role differs depending on the time period within that 500 years of the Republic. So whatever number you found, I'm sure was right at one point or another. It's never a number that you have to memorize, but it is just kind of interesting to look at how many of which job was around. So you've got kind of down here at the bottom the quaestors, who were in charge essentially of the treasury of finance. The praetors up here, who essentially were kind of like judges. Some of the key things that I want you to make sure that you take note of, so if you don't have this in your notes, you can go back in and add in as we're chatting. The consuls, as you should have looked at, there are two consuls, and these are kind of like the heads of the Roman Republic, or at least they're supposed to be like the heads of the Roman Republic. The fact that there are two of them, again, showcases the fact that the Romans really were trying to avoid any kind of system that would possibly result in one-man rule. They really wanted to, again, in 509 when they established the Republic, they really want to avoid what they had with the Etruscan kings. So they do not want to have any kind of sense of what was going on with the Tarquins and all of those really bad kings that existed. So part of what they do is they put two consuls in place, and they're only in place for a year. So that's very important in terms of keeping balances and checks. Most of the power really exists within the Senate. Now, the Senate is a body between 300 and 600 people. They are elected for life, so that's important. But a really important thing about them is they can be vetoed by different people, and also that the censors, that's a job, yes, they're census keepers, those kinds of, basic runnings of the Republic, but also the censors can kick out members of the Senate. So that's very important as well. The consuls, another really important job they had, and of course, the idea of a dictatorship becomes very important when we start looking at Caesar shortly. Consuls can also elect a dictator for 6 months at any time of crisis. So if there's really important war going on, if there's a crisis to Rome directly, the consuls could then elect, again, for 6 months, a dictator. Do they assume that that dictator will give up their role within 6 months? Yes, and if they need him for longer, maybe the consuls will ask him to stay on. But again, it's an elected role for a very specific amount of time. Something to keep in mind, again, when we start looking at Caesar. Another really important role is the aedile down here. Essentially, all that they're in charge of is um, public games, things like the gladiatorial games, the Roman bathhouses, making sure all of that stuff runs well and smoothly. But that, again, becomes very important in the empire because many of the emperors, the kind of catchphrase, motto that they have is bread and circuses. So this idea that, and we'll talk about this a lot more, but this idea that they want to, within the empire, keep the people fed and keep the people entertained so that the people won't really care what's going on in terms of the government, in terms of military. They just won't have any concerns because their bellies are full, they're entertained, so they won't care what's going on. So this job of aedile becomes very important because it is a way to gain the love and respect of the people. If you put on great gladiatorial games, if you put on great chariot races, the people will love you. And this is definitely something that Caesar uses to his advantage. Another really important role is the tribune. This is a role that is purely a plebeian role. Some of the key things that tribunes can do is they can veto anything put out by the Senate, so that's very important. They also are sacrosanct, so if they're walking around in the streets of Rome and anyone touches them, they can have them killed. So sacrosanct seems a little crazy, a little extreme, but shows you how important they were. They also can create legislation, they can pass legislation, or put it up for passing. So they are very important just themselves. And the fact that they are plebeians is important because it shows that really one of the keys to the whole Republican system was checks and balances. Avoiding kingship by making sure that certain roles could veto other roles, that no one could take full control. That the dictator, even as dictator, was only elected for 6 months. These things were very crucial to avoiding kingship and maintaining balance within the republic. Obviously, we know that we are going to come into an empire, so we know that this is going to fall apart, but ideally, the system seems like it makes sense, and it does work for a good 500 years. A really key part of the system is the Roman Republican Army. Obviously, the Romans, the two things they're most important or most kind of focused on really are that idea of military and expansion and politics. Those are two of the big things. Certainly the other thing that might get tossed in there is that idea of spectacle around the gladiatorial games and chariot racing, which for sure we will be looking at later on. The Republican Army themselves, very important. There's a series of wars, the Punic Wars, that you're going to watch a video for in a couple minutes. Very important wars. You've got soldiers are organized into large groups called legions, divided into smaller groups of 80 called a century. Basically, any citizen who owned land was required to serve in the army, but there was a great value placed in the army of the Republic. So it's not just a thing that the emperors were concerned with. The Republic was concerned with expansion and empire, or not empire, but expansion and land holdings as well. You can see here in the colors, the green was the land holdings of the Republic by 201 BCE and the orange by 100 BCE. One of the key things here is the takeover of Carthage, which is a very significant African kind of kingdom at the time, and they're one of the only people who could really challenge Rome at this point in the Republic. In terms of Romans' power themselves, they were very lenient policies towards their defeated enemies. Any of the neighboring Latins, so Rome we're looking at here, any of the neighboring Latins, anyone else kind of on that Italian boot, essentially was allowed to become a full citizen. Conquered people who were further away from Rome enjoyed all the same rights as the Roman citizens except for the right to vote. So treated fairly well. All other conquered people were called allies, and Rome essentially didn't interfere with any of these people as long as the people supplied troops to the army and didn't make treaties or friendships with any other state that Rome did not want them to. All of them were partners in Rome's growth, and Rome kind of turns its sights on that area that I highlighted called Carthage in North Africa. So you've got a video link to this video on your handout. So if you want to take a pause here and watch that so that you have an overview of the Punic Wars, that would be a good thing to do right now. Now that you're back, Punic Wars, you've got a really short little synopsis here, so it would be good to watch that video for sure. Basically, the video will show you that it's not an easy thing for Rome to take over Carthage. There's a lot of back and forth. This is also where you've got Hannibal who comes in, and you're going to watch another little video of Hannibal in a second because he's a very interesting character. But these wars really do showcase a couple things. They showcase the fact that the Roman Republic itself was strong enough to create and maintain dominance over the whole Western Mediterranean. They are very strong, even without a leader such as an emperor. The other things that are significant certainly are the fact that we're having very strong armies that are building, and those armies really are, as we will see, growing in terms of loyalty towards their commanders. Here you've got just a little map to showcase some of those battles in terms of where the Punic Wars were happening. Places controlled by Rome in purple and Carthage in orange, and then you can see some of the major battle sites. Hannibal himself is a really interesting figure to look at, so if you want to pause here and go and watch that Hannibal video and just take some notes on the kind of man that the Roman Republic was up against, because this is where you've got elephants crossing the Alps, all of those great things, and Hannibal Barca actually is a very interesting figure in history. So if you want to pause here, go watch that video, take some notes on it, and then you can come back. In terms of what happens to the Republic, because seemingly things are going really well, they're very successful over very large kingdoms such as the Carthaginian kingdom, why does it fall then? Some of the things going on within Rome are kind of going against some of the things going on in Rome kind of go against that idea of success. You do have a growing gap between the rich and the poor. So despite the fact that you've got patricians and plebeians within the Roman Republican system, there is a growing gap between the rich and poor. It leads to a lot of social unrest. You've also got a lot of power struggles coming out in the Republic, people who simply want more power than what they have. And you've got two men who kind of emerge to really showcase that initial challenge. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. I'm not going to read through all of this stuff. You can pause here and read it if you're interested. Certainly they're very important figures. Essentially what they both try to do is institute land reforms. So they want to put caps on how much land people can hold in Rome. Obviously, the main group that would affect would be the Senate, so the Senate's not very happy with it. But the proposal of the Gracchi brothers is put a cap on how much land you can own, and then all of the extra land can go to the people who are homeless or the people who are poor, and those people can then be land holders. Senate very unhappy about this. They murder Tiberius Gracchus by beating him to death with wooden chairs, so interesting death there. Gaius Gracchus actually ends up killing himself, but he does it because the Senate is enraged by what he's trying to do in reinstating his brother's laws after his brother's death, and they pass a law that essentially says that they're allowed to declare anyone they want an enemy of the state. Gaius Gracchus knows it's only a matter of time before they declare him an enemy of the state, so he kills himself. Essentially what you've got is the wealthy who are determined to keep power. You've got a bunch of political turmoil going on. And then amongst all of that, you have this other guy, Gaius Gracchus, who reforms the Republican army, removes the requirement that soldiers must own land to serve. He allows farm laborers to enlist. He makes the army a full-time professional force, and he supplies soldiers with weapons and clothing. So Gaius Marius does some things that really lead to the rise of Caesar himself. The Republic, yes, becomes more secure, but the problem is that soldiers want things that the Roman Republic is not willing to give. So what the soldiers do is they start turning to their commanders like Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar recognizes what his soldiers want, and he then starts giving them things like land and war booty. And getting their allegiance. So now it's a time where suddenly to control Rome, you need to control the army, and all of the generals have the power. This leads us right to Caesar's rise.